April 14th, 2009. A quiet town in Ohio. 12-year-old Abigail Monroe left school like she always did. She was smart, determined, and lived her life in a wheelchair after a car accident years earlier. That afternoon, she rolled to the bus stop, carrying her small blue backpack and wearing the silver bracelet her mother had given her. Classmates saw her waiting at the stop, just 2 kilometers from home. Some thought she boarded the bus. Others weren't sure. By dinner time, she hadn't returned. Her mother began to panic, calling neighbors and friends. Within hours, the search began. What they found made no sense. Abigail's wheelchair was discovered in an abandoned park, far from her route home. No signs of a struggle, no tracks, no bag. It was as if she had simply vanished. The discovery shocked the community. A girl who could not walk had disappeared without leaving a single clue. Rumors spread. A teacher, a bus driver, 2 men who had nothing to do with her disappearance would soon lose their lives and reputations to suspicion. Meanwhile, the person truly responsible walked among them. He joined the search parties. He comforted Abigail's mother. He was the neighbor who lived just across the street. For 15 years, the case grew cold. Then, by accident, the truth was uncovered. In the next section, we'll follow how the investigation unraveled, the mistakes that ruined lives, and the shocking discovery that finally exposed the real culprit. Stay with us and share your thoughts below. 12-year-old Abigail Monroe lived with her mother in a modest home not far from her middle school. She was known among classmates as the girl who always carried a notebook, writing down stories and observations about school life. 3 years earlier, a car accident had left her paralyzed from the waist down. From that moment, she depended on a wheelchair to move around. Despite that, Abigail was described as cheerful, resilient, and determined to keep up with her peers. That morning, Abigail headed to school as usual. The weather was calm, skies were clear, and the air was cool but comfortable. Several students later testified that they saw her at the stop, waiting calmly. One remembered seeing Abigail flipping through a small notebook while she sat in her chair. That was the image burned into their memory. When the bus finally arrived, the accounts diverged. A few believed they saw her board. Others said they weren't sure. No one could state with certainty what happened in those minutes. That gap in memory became a crucial hole in the investigation. By the time dinner came, Abigail had not returned home. At first, her mother thought the bus might be late. Then she thought Abigail might have stayed after school with a friend. But calls to neighbors, classmates, and the school brought the same answer. No one knew where she was. As night fell, panic took over. Her mother picked up the phone and called the police. Officers arrived quickly and began taking statements. They checked the bus schedule, spoke to the driver, and canvassed the area around the school. Nothing pointed to where Abigail might have gone. She had no history of running away. She was physically limited in mobility. Yet she was missing. Within hours, the community mobilized. Volunteers gathered at the town hall, forming search parties with flashlights and dogs. Officers combed through side streets, parks, and wooded trails. Cars drove slowly down back roads with high beams cutting through the dark. Abigail's face appeared on photocopied flyers that were taped to windows and pinned to notice boards before the night was over. But in those first frantic hours, there was nothing. Not a single clue. No sign of her backpack. No wheelchair tracks leading off the sidewalk. No neighbor who remembered seeing her after the bus stop. It was as though she had vanished in the middle of the afternoon, without anyone noticing. This was the detail that terrified investigators most. Abigail could not simply walk away. She could not run. Her independence relied entirely on her wheelchair. For her to disappear meant someone had intervened. The question was how, and why. By the early hours of the next morning, the search widened. Officers expanded the perimeter, checking alleys, parking lots, and nearby buildings. Helicopters scanned fields with searchlights. Still nothing. The first day closed with no progress, no leads, and no answers. That night, her mother sat awake, waiting for the phone to ring with news. The silence was unbearable. For investigators, the disappearance of Abigail Monroe was no longer just a missing persons report. It was the beginning of a mystery that would haunt the town for years. A child who could not move on her own had vanished without leaving a trace. And the first chapter of this story ended with the most haunting question. How could Abigail, confined to a wheelchair, disappear from a bus stop in broad daylight without anyone knowing where she went? As we move forward, we'll follow what the police uncovered in the days ahead, the first shocking discovery that shifted the case, and how one piece of evidence would send the investigation down the wrong path for more than a decade. The search for Abigail Monroe began the very night she failed to return home. Police officers and neighbors spread out across the quiet Ohio town carrying flashlights and calling her name. Her mother stood by the phone, waiting for news. Hour after hour passed. There was nothing. By dawn, dozens of volunteers had joined the effort. They checked alleys, backyards, and wooded paths. Then, in the early morning light, one search group made a discovery that would set the tone for the entire case. In an abandoned park on the edge of town, far from the route Abigail would normally take, they found her wheelchair. It was standing upright, near a cracked path covered in weeds. The scene was quiet, too quiet. The wheelchair looked untouched, as if someone had placed it there deliberately. No scratches, no bent wheels, no signs of damage. For investigators, the discovery was both shocking and confusing. The park itself made no sense. Abigail had no reason to be there. It was in the opposite direction from her home. With her limited mobility, reaching that location on her own was impossible. Police immediately considered the possibility that the chair had been moved. Someone had taken Abigail away, then brought the wheelchair to the park to stage the scene. Officers examined the ground around it. They looked for tire marks, drag marks, or footprints. They found nothing. The dirt was dry, the grass flattened only in small patches, but not enough to... News spread quickly. Within hours, the entire town knew that the missing girl's wheelchair had been located. Crowds gathered outside the police perimeter, whispering, speculating. Was it a kidnapping? Had someone grabbed her at the bus stop? The chair became the centerpiece of every conversation. The press arrived soon after. Photographers captured images of the wheelchair under the morning sun. Those pictures were printed on front pages and broadcast on local television. The empty chair became a haunting symbol of Abigail's disappearance. Detectives tried to reconstruct the timeline. Witnesses were re-interviewed. Students recalled seeing Abigail waiting at the bus stop, but could not agree on whether she boarded the bus. The driver insisted he never saw her. No one had reported unusual activity on the road that afternoon, and yet, less than 24 hours later, her wheelchair appeared in a place she could not have reached. Theories began to circulate. Some believed Abigail had been lured by someone she trusted. Others thought a stranger might have forced her into a car and dumped the chair to confuse investigators. Police leaned toward the second theory, convinced the scene was meant to mislead them. At a press conference, the lead investigator admitted, The location doesn't make sense. Someone wanted us to find the chair here. The question is why. The impact on the community was immediate. Parents held their children closer. Strangers eyed one another with suspicion. The idea that a 12-year-old girl in a wheelchair could disappear so completely, with her chair abandoned in an empty park, was terrifying. Rumors spread fast. Some residents were convinced it was an outsider who had passed through town. Others whispered about people they already distrusted. For Abigail's family, the discovery only deepened the nightmare. The chair confirmed she had been taken, but it gave no clue about where she was or who had her. Police poured resources into the search around the park. Teams of officers walked every trail, searched abandoned buildings, and used dogs to pick up a scent. The results were frustrating. The dogs circled the chair, then lost the trail within minutes. There was no continuous scent line, no path. By the second day, the investigation had shifted. This was no longer treated as a case of a child who wandered off. Police announced that they believed foul play was involved. Still, with no witnesses and no physical evidence beyond the chair, there was little to build on. For the public, the wheelchair became the defining image of the case. It was replayed again and again in the media, sparking outrage and fear. People asked how a girl so vulnerable, so visible, could vanish in the middle of the day. The discovery also had a dangerous effect. It narrowed the direction of the investigation. Because the chair was found far from Abigail's home, police initially dismissed the idea that someone close by could be responsible. They focused instead on outsiders, drifters, or strangers passing through town. It was a logical step at the time, but it would later prove to be a devastating mistake. That mistake would allow the real perpetrator to live undisturbed in the very same neighborhood, blending in as though nothing had happened. But on that morning in April 2009, no one knew this. All they had was an empty chair in an abandoned park, a missing 12-year-old girl, and a community on edge. The sense of fear was rising, and the case was already heading down the wrong path. In the following chapter, we'll look at how the community reacted to this discovery, the way the search expanded, and how the pressure from the public and the press began to shape the investigation. The discovery of Abigail Monroe's wheelchair spread through town in less than a day. What began as a local missing child case quickly escalated into something much larger. For a small community that rarely saw violent crime, the disappearance of a 12-year-old girl confined to a wheelchair was unthinkable. By the second night, the atmosphere had changed completely. Search parties multiplied. People who had never met the Monroe family volunteered to help. Groups of men and women walked through forests with flashlights, swept the banks of the nearby river, and climbed into abandoned industrial buildings that had long been ignored. The urgency was clear. Everyone believed Abigail's life depended on finding her quickly. Parents reacted, but with that visibility came pressure. Television trucks parked outside the Monroe home. Local reporters filled the yard with cameras and microphones. National outlets soon followed, framing the story as a mystery that could have happened in any American town. For Abigail's family, the attention was overwhelming. They were grateful for the support, but the spotlight was relentless. Every word, every expression, every tear was scrutinized. Neighbors were drawn into the coverage as well. Journalists knocked on doors asking who had seen what, who might have noticed something strange. Some cooperated, others closed their doors in frustration. The case was no longer just a police investigation. It was a public spectacle. In the middle of this chaos, one man became a familiar figure. The neighbor who lived directly across from the Monroe family attended nearly every search. He walked beside volunteers, handed out water, and often stood next to Abigail's mother. He was photographed comforting her, helping coordinate search groups and speaking with reporters about the community's determination. His presence was so consistent that he was seen as the model of a supportive neighbor. No one questioned his motives. The result was that suspicion never touched him. With police focused on the strange discovery of the wheelchair in the park and the public searching for an outsider to blame, the neighbor blended into the background of good intentions. His eagerness to help shielded him from doubt. Meanwhile, fear and speculation grew. People began creating theories to explain what had happened. Some believed a stranger had taken Abigail from the bus stop and left the chair in the park to confuse investigators. Others suspected someone who had passed through town briefly and vanished. Conversations at grocery stores and schools circled endlessly around what might have happened and who could have been responsible. The police tried to keep control of the investigation, but the weight of public expectation was already shaping their decisions. Each press conference demanded answers even when there were none to give. Detectives admitted they were working with very limited evidence. The only physical item tied to Abigail's disappearance was the chair, and it revealed nothing about who had left it there or where she had been taken. The pressure spread to the Monroe family. The community itself began to fracture under the stress. Some people wanted to believe that the abductor was a stranger. Others whispered suspicions about people they already distrusted. Long-standing tensions inside the town deepened, fueled by rumors and speculation. Within a week, the disappearance of Abigail Monroe was no longer just a missing person case. It was a public obsession. The empty wheelchair had become a symbol. For residents, it represented fear. For the press, it represented headlines. And for investigators, it represented a mystery that was already pulling them in the wrong direction. The stage was set for mistakes. With the community desperate for answers and the media amplifying every rumor, attention would soon turn toward people who had nothing to do with Abigail's disappearance. And once suspicion fell, lives would be ruined. In the days following Abigail Monroe's disappearance, detectives struggled. The wheelchair had been found, but no other trace of her existed. Leads were scarce. There was no DNA, no witnesses pointing to a stranger, no electronic trail to follow. The case was stalling, and investigators began to look closer at the people in Abigail's life. It didn't take long before their attention turned to one of her teachers. He was young, dedicated, and well known at the middle school. He had a reputation for helping students beyond class hours, offering extra tutoring, even giving rides home after extracurricular activities. To many, he seemed like a model teacher. But in the tense environment of a missing child case, details that once looked admirable began to raise suspicion. Some students mentioned that he often spoke with Abigail after school. Others said he paid extra attention to her assignments, sometimes praising her in front of the class in ways that made her stand out. At first, these stories sounded harmless, but rumors spread quickly. Soon the picture began to change. The teacher was now being described as too close to his students, and specifically to Abigail. Investigators then uncovered a detail that pushed the suspicion further. Just weeks before Abigail vanished, when police interviewed those students, the argument was retold with more drama each time. Soon it was no longer a minor disagreement. It was evidence, at least in the public eye, that the teacher might have had a motive. The media seized on this angle. Headlines described a teacher who clashed with a vulnerable girl. Reporters painted a picture of a man who had both access and opportunity. He had the trust of the students, and in the minds of many, that made him capable of betrayal. Stories speculated about a possible hidden relationship, and some even suggested he had grown obsessed with Abigail. The teacher was brought in for questioning multiple times. Detectives pressed him on his relationship with Abigail, his routine on the day she vanished, and the details of that argument. He admitted there had been a dispute, but insisted it was nothing unusual. "I was frustrated. She was frustrated. That was it. I would never hurt her," he told investigators. Yet there was no physical evidence to clear or convict him. No DNA linked him to the wheelchair. No witnesses placed him near the park. His alibi, while thin, placed him at home grading papers the evening Abigail went missing. Still, in the eyes of the community, the lack of evidence wasn't enough to erase suspicion. The school board, under immense public pressure, made its move. He was placed on administrative leave, then suspended indefinitely. Parents were outraged that someone accused of impropriety had been left in charge of their children for so long. They gathered at meetings, demanding answers, demanding disturbance. At home, the teacher's personal life unraveled. His wife filed for divorce, unwilling to face the stares and whispers that followed them everywhere. His parents, long respected in town, suddenly felt the sting of humiliation. Neighbors turned their backs. Friends stopped calling. In the grocery store, people whispered as he walked past. On the streets, children pointed. Weeks turned into months, and police still could not connect him to the disappearance. They searched his home, his car, even his electronic devices. Nothing linked him to Abigail. No photos, no notes. This was the beginning of a pattern. Whenever evidence failed, rumors filled the gap. And in the absence of truth, suspicion became its own form of justice. For the teacher, the accusation was a life sentence, even without a trial. The investigation moved forward, but his name remained scarred. In every conversation about Abigail, someone brought him up. That teacher, they'd say. For many, he would always be the first suspect. And yet the real culprit lived freely, hidden in plain sight, untouched by the spotlight. When the case against the teacher began to collapse, investigators and the public turned to another possible suspect: the bus driver. He was already known in town, notorious, in fact. People whispered about him long before Abigail disappeared. He had been caught drinking while on duty. No accidents had ever happened, but his reputation was stained. To the community, he was careless, reckless, and unfit to be trusted with children. That reputation now came back to haunt him. Abigail had vanished at the bus stop. Her wheelchair was later found in a park, far from where she should have been. For many, the answer seemed obvious. If she disappeared waiting for the bus, then the man behind the wheel had to know something. "It must have been him," neighbors muttered. The story fit too neatly. Then came another detail, one that fueled the fire. Several students recalled seeing Abigail argue with the driver only weeks before she vanished. The dispute started over something simple: Abigail's wheelchair blocking the aisle when she boarded. But it quickly escalated into a shouting match that everyone remembered. "I'm sick of waiting for you every single day," the driver snapped in front of the other kids. "You slow down the whole route." Abigail, humiliated and furious, shot back. "At least I'm not drunk at work. Everyone knows what you do." The bus went silent. The insult struck hard, and the driver's face turned red. He leaned closer and hissed, "Watch your mouth, little girl. One day you'll regret talking to me like that." He denied everything. "I had nothing to do with that girl," he told reporters as cameras followed him to his car. But his words carried no weight. His past mistakes drowned them out. At home, his family paid the price. Children at school mocked his kids, whispering that their father had kidnapped Abigail. His wife was harassed in grocery stores. Neighbors stopped talking to them. The shame was suffocating. Within weeks, the bus company terminated his contract. Officially, they cited his drinking history, but everyone knew the real reason. No parent wanted him driving their children again. His career ended in silence, and he disappeared from public life. Police eventually cleared him. They confirmed he was not driving Abigail's route on the day she vanished. Surveillance records from his assigned line backed up his alibi. He was nowhere near her bus stop. But the community did not care. Facts had less power than fear. In their eyes, a man with a temper and a drinking problem was dangerous, and Abigail's disappearance gave them a story to attach to his flaws. Over the years, the damage never healed. Even after official statements cleared him, he was still whispered about as the real suspect. He avoided public places, stayed inside, and spoke to almost no one. His children grew up under the weight of accusations that were never true. His name was permanently linked to Abigail Monroe, even though he had no part in what happened to her. The tragedy of his life ran parallel to the tragedy of Abigail's disappearance. While her family suffered from not knowing what happened, he suffered from everyone believing he was responsible. He was never charged. He never went to trial. But his sentence was carried out by rumors, suspicion, and the relentless gaze of a community desperate for answers. The wheelchair in the park had misled everyone. The wrong people became the focus. A teacher lost his career. A bus driver lost his life in every way that mattered. And still, the real culprit was never questioned. The case against the bus driver eventually faded from headlines, but not from memory. In town, his face remained tied to Abigail's name. At gatherings, people still mentioned. The investigation reached a breaking point. After weeks of chasing leads, interrogating suspects, and combing through neighborhoods, police had to admit the truth. They were stuck. The two main suspects, the young teacher and the bus driver, had both been cleared. Yet Abigail was still missing, and there was nothing else to hold on to. There was no body, no weapon, no blood, not even a single trace of DNA. Thousands of hours had been spent searching. Officers and volunteers had swept through homes, basements, empty warehouses, riverbanks, and dense woods. They found nothing. It was as if Abigail had vanished into thin air. The lack of physical evidence made every step forward collapse into frustration. Local police, overwhelmed, called in investigators from the state. Fresh eyes combed the case files, rechecked witness statements, and studied every possible timeline. But even with additional manpower, no new clue emerged. The trail had gone cold almost immediately after the discovery of the empty wheelchair. At first, the media kept the case alive. Abigail's name and photo were on front pages, broadcast on the evening news, and shared in community bulletins. But the coverage did not last. As weeks passed without answers, the spotlight shifted. New crimes filled headlines. Other tragedies demanded airtime. Abigail's disappearance, once the top story, slipped into the background. For her family, silence was never an option. Her mother appeared on local TV begging for help, pleading for answers. She mailed letters to the police chief, wrote appeals to the governor, and called news stations to keep Abigail's face visible. She would not allow her daughter to fade into memory. Still, the most haunting image was her ritual at the abandoned park. Every week she carried fresh flowers to the place where the wheelchair was found. It was a silent protest against forgetting, a reminder that her child's story was not finished. The community, however, changed. The fear that once electrified the town gave way to exhaustion. Families who once joined the search stopped showing up. Neighbors who once locked their doors out of fear began to... And through it all, the man responsible lived freely. He walked the same streets, waved to the same neighbors, and stood only yards away from Abigail's grieving mother. He had fooled everyone. By placing the wheelchair in the park, he had bought himself years of protection. And because the investigation focused elsewhere, no one dared to suspect the helpful neighbor across the street. The truth remained buried, sealed not only by the lack of evidence, but also by the clever disguise of the killer himself. Abigail's story had become a mystery that no one could solve. But the story wasn't over. 15 years later, a discovery in another case would pull Abigail's name back into the headlines. A discovery so shocking, it would expose the person no one ever suspected and reveal the hidden truth behind her disappearance. Before we move to that next chapter, I want to hear your thoughts. Do you think investigators gave up too early? And do you believe communities should keep pushing cases like this, even when years pass without answers? Share your opinion and stay with us. The breakthrough is coming. The truth was darker than anyone in that Ohio town ever imagined. The man who took Abigail Monroe wasn't a stranger passing through. He wasn't a shadowy figure from another county. He was the man who lived directly across the street. A middle-aged neighbor who most people described as quiet, polite, and even helpful. On the surface, he blended in. He cut his grass, waved to passers-by, and joined community gatherings. When Abigail disappeared, he showed up for the searches. He stood next to her mother, offering words of comfort. Cameras caught him placing flyers on telephone poles. To everyone else, he looked like one of the most dedicated volunteers. But under his home, hidden from view, was the secret that explained everything. Beneath the floor of that house was a basement no one knew about, a private bunker built years earlier. Its walls were lined with thick concrete, sealed to block out sound. The door had multiple locks, reinforced so no one inside could escape. On the day she vanished, his opportunity came. Abigail was waiting at the bus stop, her bag in her lap, her journal open. Some classmates remembered seeing her, but none noticed the moment she disappeared. That was his opening. Witnesses later said they thought she got on the bus, but they couldn't be certain. In reality, the neighbor approached her before the bus arrived. He offered her a ride. Maybe he said her mother had asked him to help, Maybe he pretended the bus was running late. Abigail knew him. He wasn't a stranger, so there was no reason for her to be afraid. That trust was all he needed. Within minutes, she was inside his vehicle. He didn't drive far. He pulled directly into his driveway across the street. From the outside, it looked like he was coming home as usual. But instead of leading her inside the main house, he brought her down into the bunker. Once the door closed, Abigail was gone from the world above. Hours later, while police and neighbors searched for her, the man moved quickly to cover his tracks. He lifted her wheelchair into his truck and drove it to an abandoned park on the edge of town. Leaving it there was a calculated move. He wanted investigators to believe she had been taken somewhere far away. He wanted to push them toward strangers, drifters, anyone but him. The plan worked. Detectives followed false leads. Reporters built stories around teachers and bus drivers. The town whispered about outsiders. All the while, the man who lived just across the street watched the chaos unfold from his front porch. He listened to rumors swirl, confident that no one suspected the kind neighbor who was always nearby. For years he played this role perfectly. He showed up to vigils, standing close enough to Abigail's mother to be photographed at her side. He bowed his head in prayer. He comforted families and spoke with reporters, saying he hoped the girl would be found safe. The performance was flawless. He appeared as one of the most loyal supporters of the family, when in fact, he was the one who had destroyed them. Abigail was not his only victim. That bunker beneath his home told a bigger story. The shelves and hidden compartments held belongings. It wasn't until much later, after new crimes surfaced in another state, that his double life unraveled. By then, Abigail's case had already gone cold. The years of searching, the countless interviews, the ruined lives of wrongly accused men, all of it had shielded the true monster. He continued living as though nothing had happened. To his neighbors, he was still the polite man who helped with groceries, who joined search parties, who offered a shoulder to cry on. The truth sat below his feet, behind a locked door, sealed in concrete. When the truth finally came to light, the revelation stunned everyone. The good neighbor, the volunteer, the man in photographs comforting a grieving mother, was the killer they had been looking for all along. And for Abigail Monroe, it was already too late. This chapter of the story forces a painful realization. Evil does not always look like evil. Sometimes it looks like the man next door. Sometimes it smiles, it waves, it shakes your hand, and it prays with you. Meanwhile, beneath the surface, it hides a secret too horrifying to imagine. In the next section, we will follow how investigators years later stumbled upon the evidence that finally exposed him. The discoveries inside that hidden bunker would reveal not only Abigail's fate, but also the full scale of his crimes. Stay with this story as we uncover how the truth finally broke through the silence. 15 years had passed since the day Abigail Monroe vanished from her small Ohio town. For her family, every day was a reminder of unanswered questions. For law enforcement, her case was one of many in the long list of unsolved disappearances. But hundreds of miles away, in another state, investigators were working on a series of murders that suddenly brought her story back to life. Police there had linked several brutal crimes to a single suspect. As they reviewed patterns, they noticed unusual details that matched cases from other states. One detective, reviewing archived files, noticed a similarity to the disappearance of a 12-year-old girl in Ohio, Abigail Monroe. The investigators decided to pursue him. At first, their goal was only to eliminate him from suspicion, but the more they looked, the more troubling details emerged. Property records revealed that his home had been modified decades earlier, with undocumented renovations. A contractor had once filed a complaint about unpaid work that described strange construction beneath the house. And neighbors had occasionally mentioned hearing the sound of machinery late at night. These fragments were enough to justify a search warrant. A team of officers arrived at the modest house on a quiet street. From the outside, it looked ordinary. Neatly trimmed grass, white paint fading with age, nothing remarkable. But inside, the search took a chilling turn. In the basement, behind a row of shelves stacked with old tools and boxes, officers discovered a locked door. The homeowner tried to explain it away as a storage area, but the lock was new, heavy, and reinforced. When police forced it open, they found a narrow passage leading to a hidden staircase. What they uncovered was a fully built underground bunker, sealed off from sound and sight. The walls were thick concrete, the ceiling lined with insulation, every detail designed to muffle noise. There were restraints, old furniture, and discarded items no one could account for. The officers' flashlights swept across the room, revealing shelves stacked with boxes. Inside those boxes were personal belongings: shoes, clothing, school bags, jewelry. Each piece neatly arranged, catalogued in his own twisted way. It was a collection of trophies from victims. Among them lay a small silver bracelet, a bracelet once given by Abigail's mother to her daughter. The engraving on the inside was still clear: "To Abigail, with love." That single item shattered any doubt. After 15 years, the mystery of Abigail's disappearance was no longer a mystery. The home was secured as a crime scene. Forensic teams moved in, collecting evidence late into the night. DNA swabs from the walls, the floor, and the stored items returned hits in the national database. Several news spread quickly. Reporters who had once praised him as a helpful neighbor now ran headlines calling him one of the most dangerous predators in state history. Photographs resurfaced, images of him walking side by side with Abigail's mother during community searches, speaking at vigils, standing in the background of news reports. The betrayal stunned everyone who had ever trusted him. For the Monroe family, the discovery was devastating. On one hand, they finally had an answer. They finally knew what had happened to Abigail. But the cost of that answer was unbearable. 15 years of waiting, 15 years of false hopes, and the truth was far darker than anything they had imagined. The community reacted with shock and guilt. Many remembered how strongly they had suspected the teacher and the bus driver, how they had whispered rumors and destroyed reputations. Meanwhile, the real killer had been living across the street, blending into every search party, every prayer circle. He had manipulated their trust and used it as his shield. The case quickly became a national story. Commentators called it one of the most disturbing examples of misdirection in modern investigations. For years, the staged scene with the abandoned wheelchair had sent detectives down the wrong path. For years, the very man responsible had been celebrated for his dedication to finding Abigail. Law enforcement reviewed every decision, every oversight. They admitted that the early elimination of local suspects had been a mistake. The abandoned wheelchair had been taken at face value rather than as deliberate staging. Evidence that could have raised suspicions about the neighbor had been ignored in the rush to find fast answers. With the confession secured, prosecutors prepared charges for multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and unlawful imprisonment. The evidence from the underground bunker was more than enough to ensure conviction. But for many, the legal outcome could not erase the haunting reality that justice had arrived far too late for Abigail. When the story broke publicly, vigils were held again, just as they had been 15 years earlier. But this time, the candles were lit not for hope, but for remembrance. Abigail's name was spoken, her photograph displayed, her silver bracelet shone on the evening news. For the first time, the Monroe family knew the truth, and for the first time, the community realized how deeply they had been deceived. Abigail's case, once a symbol of fear and confusion, became a symbol of hard lessons learned. The danger had never come from strangers passing through town. It had lived right across the street, hiding in plain sight, smiling as it joined the search. And though justice had finally arrived, it carried with it a bitter truth. No matter how carefully people searched, the answer had always been buried beneath their feet. 15 years after the disappearance of Abigail Monroe, her family finally received an answer. The discovery of the hidden bunker and the confession of the neighbor ended the mystery. But the truth arrived too late to bring Abigail home. What remained was loss, grief, and a long list of lives destroyed along the way. For Abigail's mother, the pain was impossible to shake. For years, she had accepted comfort from the very man who had taken her daughter. He stood beside her during searches. He placed his hand on her shoulder during prayer vigils. She led him into her house, into her grief. When his crimes were exposed, the betrayal cut even deeper. She lived with the torment of having trusted the person she should have feared most. The damage was not limited to her family. Two men who were once accused, though innocent, carried scars that would never fade. The young teacher, suspended from his job and abandoned by his wife, never rebuilt his career. Friends stopped calling. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid him, and years later he still lived under a shadow. The bus driver fared no better. Labeled a drunk and a predator, he was fired from his job, his children mocked in school. Even after the police cleared him, suspicion followed him everywhere. Both men became victims of rumor and fear, punished by a town that needed someone to blame. The case became a cautionary tale. It showed how dangerous unchecked suspicion can be, how quickly gossip can ruin lives. Investigators later admitted that public pressure influenced their decisions. Instead of focusing on hard evidence, they allowed speculation to drive the case. The real killer watched from across the street and took comfort in the chaos he had created. When the truth finally came out, the town responded with shock and shame. A memorial service was held in the center of town. Candles lined the steps of the courthouse, and Abigail's name was spoken alongside those of other victims of the same killer. People who had searched for her as children returned as adults to honor her. Parents who once held their kids close that spring night now stood in silence, realizing how wrong they had been about who the threat really was. The community wanted something lasting. A scholarship was created in Abigail's name, designed to help students with disabilities who showed the same determination she was known for. Her story was meant to give strength to others, even though she herself had been silenced. National media turned the case into a lesson. Articles pointed out how investigators ignored the closest suspect because of one staged clue: the wheelchair found in the park. Experts emphasized the importance of revisiting cold cases, of protecting evidence, of not letting early assumptions control an investigation. Abigail's case was cited in police training manuals as an example of what can go wrong when bias and rumor lead the way. Local residents carried their own burden of guilt. Many asked themselves the same question. How could they have trusted the man who lived across from the Monroes for so long? He had eaten at their barbecues, joined their search teams, prayed in their churches. For 15 years they believed his lies. The shame of having welcomed him into their homes never left them. The end of the case did not bring peace. It only underscored the cost of failure. Justice had come, but late, and at a terrible price. For the Monroe family, Abigail would always remain 12 years old, frozen in the memory of that spring day when she left school and never returned. Her name lived on, but only as part of a story that exposed both the cruelty of a predator and the mistakes of an entire community. The case of Abigail Monroe became more than a tragedy. It became a symbol of how truth can hide in plain sight, how innocence can be destroyed by suspicion, and how justice, when delayed, never feels complete. Abigail's life was stolen, her family scarred, and her town forever marked by the choices it made and the choices it failed to make. Her story is still told today, not only as a warning, but as a call for vigilance, fairness, and persistence. Because for every cold case like Abigail's, there are families still waiting, still searching, still hoping the truth will be found before it is too late. And as we move forward, one question remains. How many more stories like Abigail's are still buried in silence, waiting for someone to uncover them? If you've been following this case, share your thoughts below. What stood out to you most in the long fight for answers? And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter, where we'll explore another case that reveals just how fragile justice can be.